Deployment of the Ford aircraft carrier to the Caribbean.
Tropical storm Melissa churns over the Caribbean. Hemp strike against a suspected drug running boat.
So you just heard the news.
Bueno, ya escucharon sobre los titulares.
Yeah, very catchy, very engaging, almost always shallow. Headlines give you the shape, but it rarely ever gives you the texture of the story. More times than not, Caribbean experiences are flattened into these really simplistic narratives, very tiny boxes that are convenient for researchers and reporters to discuss us and what our realities are like. We're either moralistic, we're troubled, or just exotic, a nice place to relax, right? But we're much more than that. Today, you will have the opportunity to hear voices that the headlines usually ignore. Hear from a young woman who's too afraid to ask questions, a lesbian who's received the most ridiculous medical advice, a gender non-conforming person who was shamed in a private clinic, and a trans man forced into performing for legitimacy. These are stories. These are real, lived conditions that determine who has access to safe, dignified care in the region. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's listen.
Any topic underneath sexual and reproductive health has always been an uneasy topic to speak about, especially as a girl from a religious background. One of my biggest problems with church, they made the environment so unsafe. No one ever felt safe to talk about anything. Because the minute you ask a question about your health, they automatically assume you're sexually active or you want to be sexually active. When that wasn't the case, you're just curious, you just want to know, right?
What you've heard is it's pretty typical in the Caribbean, across our islands, across our communities. Conservatism runs the game, basically. So you're forced into these situations where your values, your community values, your household values become barriers to information, to safety, to care and support. What this leads to is youth shrinking, becoming silent, delaying care, increasing their risk of STI transmission, pregnancies, and even incidences of sexual violence. It doesn't have to be that way. There's simple solutions for this. No mistake, the silence is harmful, but we do have an opportunity here where we can redesign these systems and services to meet the youth where they are. We can meet them, give them flexible, accessible hours. We can give them private, confidential referral and intake opportunities. We give them legislation that grants them agency, access to comprehensive sexuality education so that they can be informed in their choices. Well, evidence and research, case studies are very valuable. They're important. But they don't answer the questions. Where was the trust broken in the Caribbean? In our homes, in our schools, our health centers? What do we do to rebuild it? This is why Caribbean research is so essential to the work that we're doing. But that's just one experience. Let's hear another.
In the initial intake, everybody is asking all the usual questions. Do you have any new partners? Do you engage in any risky behaviors? Stuff like that. And when he got to the question about using protection, I used the opportunity to explain that, hey, I don't sleep with straight cis men, I'm a lesbian. And there's a moment of confusion, not on my part, but on his. He looked at me strangely and then went on to say, yeah, you don't really need to do this because your risk is so much lower. And I just thought it was the most insane thing I'd ever heard, especially from a medical professional.
Sad to say that this is a very common refrain from lesbian, bisexual, and queer women in the Caribbean. Misinformation and provider bias leads to not just confusion in the clinics, but it can lead to obstetric and medical violence, harm that doesn't need to occur. Now, we would imagine training is simple. Let's just train them. But from a region that has been polluted by colonial values, it's difficult to challenge conservatism and just begin education on SOGS issues. We're forced to find programs that are culturally sensitive, culturally rooted in our realities to ensure that service providers understand, care, and do not continue this type of harm. I want to talk about another person right now. Let's hear what they have to say.
I remember even a moment when I was trying to go and get a checkup at a private doctor, and the nurses behind the counter were just going on and on about how they would never serve a non-binary person or a trans person. Mind you, I'm sitting right there. And it's difficult too because trans people are at such a high risk of violence, of physical abuse. And so if we aren't able to access the kind of care we need after incidences like that, then who's really there to protect us?
What you just heard was not just stigma and discrimination. This is fear, real fears that we face in the Caribbean. If you are gender non-conforming, your experience within our health sector or any social program is incredibly fraught with tension and trauma. It's not simply staff in a private facility proudly discussing their queerphobia, refusing service. This is beyond discrimination. This is a refusal and a breach of duty to care. When you look at the numbers, the levels of violence that trans and gender non-conforming persons experience in our region, private facility, which is usually considered safer than a public one, slams the door in your face. A closed door can cost lives. This is unacceptable. In the Caribbean, we demand that we have rapid referral systems. We have mandatory anti-discrimination policies. We ensure that persons are cared for in their fullness, in their diversity, without punishment, without persecution. But it's just one experience. I want to listen to another.
The psychiatrist she sent me by, that was a mess. You have to tell the doctor the story they want to hear. And the story they want to hear is, you knew you were trans since you were in diapers, and you always knew it as you were growing up, even though there are concerted efforts by our society to hide and conceal this information and have you believe that trans people don't exist. The thing that we end up having to do for psychologists and psychiatrists to get the go-ahead to start HRT then in turn influences the studies that they do, because we telling them the stories they want to hear, because if we don't, they don't give us what we want, and then they go ahead and then write down the stories that they wanted to hear anyway as fact.
When I heard that submission, that came to mind with distortion, corruption, reduction, once again being reduced into a flat, simple story. Researchers and service providers, there is this over-reliance on a singular narrative. There is only one experience that is validated and allowed care and access. This is where we need to challenge it, because this distortion does not simply harm an individual. It literally damages the evidence, the research, the data that we need to develop policies on. So service providers continue to lean on global noise, lean on these singular experiences to justify service. It takes inequality into the evidence from the source. Unacceptable. This does not help us now, it will not help us tomorrow. The Caribbean Observatory on Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights has taken up the challenge source information to promote, advocate for inclusive, community-led research that not only grounds the reality of the Caribbean, expands the global understanding of who we are and what we need. This is not simply a call to action, this is a call for change. If you want to see the Caribbean represented, reflected, and respected in everything that we do regarding SRHR, the time is now for you to invest just in our stories, not just in our research, but invest in our futures. Thank you.